Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Hey everyone, it's Fox from ModelMaking.Guru here. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Tabletop Trauma Centre, a series in which I find terrible minis on eBay that have been painted with Artex ceiling paint, half a potato and a dead cat, and I nurse them back to awesomeness using all the skills I've learned in my great brain, and maybe also show the original artist how to do better next time. In this first series, I've been nursing this worse-for-wear Leman Russ back to some semblance of respectability. It's old, as evidenced by the black plastic tracks and the metal commander. So far, I've stripped the paint away, made some slight repairs and added extra details, and have completed all the base colour painting to get to this stage. Today, we seal the deal and finish the project with the funnest bit that I love the most: weathering. Yes! Let's crack on. The first step was to replace the decal that was removed when I stripped the paint. Thankfully, it's a generic Games Workshop Imperial Guard decal, so this was no problem. I thought I'd add some little kill counts too for fun. Games Workshop decals are super easy and super forgiving to apply. The decals are cut from the backing sheet and dipped in warm water for a few seconds, then they're pulled out and left in a drop of water until they freely move around on the backing paper. This means they're ready to roll. Once in position, I squished them with a cotton bud, that's a Q-tip to our colonial cousins. To remove any excess water, note how I'm rolling the bud along and not just dragging it. I don't want the decal to move. Making sure there's no water under there is vital to ensure you don't end up with air pockets later. Once the decals had 5 minutes to dry, I applied decal setting solutions. Firstly, Microscale Industries Micro Set to help them suck down to the surface as closely as possible. And then once that had dried, Micro Sol to soften them and help them conform even more and to get that painted on look. Once that dried, it was time to get dirty. Whoa! The first weathering step is chipping, and I'll be doing a two-stage chip on this model. I started with Nurgling Green, which is a perfect highlight colour for the green on the hull. The trick to chipping is to try and think how actual chips occur in paint. Unless they combine, individually they are usually very small. You'll rarely see a chip bigger than your hand, so keep that in mind as you paint them. The light green colour simulates where the paint has been distressed but not fully chipped away. The top layer of paint and dirt and grime has been removed, leaving a light, clean, fresh patch of paint behind. This step was simply a case of slowly working around the model, applying tiny chips where it makes sense that paint will have been damaged. Contact surfaces, edges, areas where feet and hands would scratch, and so on. I also painted very fine lines here and there to suggest scratches. Now, there is no real skill here, just patience and a very fine tip on your brush. I find the smaller Games & Gears Advanced Series brushes perfect for this. Once the green areas were chipped, I cracked open some Dawnstone to chip the black and dark grey areas. Like the Nurgling green, it's a perfect highlight colour for black. The process was the same as before. Now, you would be forgiven for thinking that these chip colours are way too bright and contrasty, and you are right, but there is method to this madness. Keep watching. Next up was Wild Rider Red, to chip the red identification stripes at the front of the tank. And white scar was used on the white identification stripes and white panels on the turret. Now, I am painting white chips on white panels, but remember that the white panels were deliberately painted as an off-white, not an actual bright white. So the white chips show up. This is why you should never paint whites as actual whites. There's just no highlight colour for white. Next, it was time to move on to the dozer blade, and I started with Dorn Yellow, a perfect highlight colour for the yellow hazard stripes. Now again, you may think the contrasting colour a little extreme, but it will make sense in the end, don't worry. At this point, I'm simulating heavily distressed paint because of the job that the blade does, and I wasn't worried about getting yellow chips on the black stripes. I needed the yellow chips all over to get in my mind the overall shape of the chipped area. Once the yellow chips had dried, I went back over them with Dawnstone, where they were over the black stripes. With that done, it was time for Rhinox hide. Now, I said these were two-stage chips, and what I've painted so far is distressed paint. Now I need to show where the paint has been removed and metal underneath is exposed, and in this case rusted. Rhinox hide is a great colour for simulating old dark rust and is the second stage of the chipping process. I simply painted Rhinox hide inside the highlight chips, not covering them completely, rather leaving a thin edge. You're left with a rusty chip surrounded by a fine highlight, giving a three-dimensional feel to the chip. This method is much less time consuming than painting a dark chip first and then adding a highlight later. I applied it sparingly to all the chip colours except the chips on the dozer blade face, and I deliberately left some chips as just highlights to suggest a variation in both intensity and age of the paint damage. I took a different tack on the dozer blade face. Here, the interior chip colour will be Leadbelcher. I like to think that the metal of the blade is constantly being rubbed and scraped and ground clean through use, so corrosion doesn't really have time to take place and you're left with shiny bare metal exposed instead. Like the Rhinox hide, this is painted within the highlight chips. After all this, I now have a tank that looks much more used, but I need to reduce the contrast of the whole model now, make all those bright and dark colours come together and start to add actual dirt, and this is also where the bright chip colours will be toned down. The first step to doing this requires 2 brushes and oil paint, or 2, or 3, 4, 5. The first task was to apply a dot filter. Now this must be done over a matte finish, either over a matte varnish coat or over bare unvarnished paint, and can only be done with oil paint, no other paint. Now it doesn't really matter what colours you use, but you can balance out more or less to a specific colour. The colours I used here lean more towards brown, as that's the tint I'm looking for. I have a mixture of 502 Abteilung modelling oil paints and regular artist oil paints. I chose 502 Abteilung Light Rust Brown, 502 Abteilung Earth, 502 Abteilung Dark Rust, 502 Abteilung Olive Green, Winsor & Newton Winton Oil Colour Permanent Green Light, and Rowney Artist Oil Colour Naples Yellow. Now, the purpose of a dot filter is to simply add a slight tint, a filter, to the model, randomly and unevenly, to simulate a patina of dirt, grime and faded paint. If I used nothing but green here, the model would just take on a green tint, a blue would give a blue tint, and so on. However, because I'm using multiple colours, the filter will be less uniform and more random and varied. The colours I chose were skewed towards the brown because I want it to overall be a brown tint, but with hints of other colours. The green would suggest areas where there might be algae staining from pooled water. The blue might cause little patches that look like sun-faded paint. It's usually best to go random, but lean towards the general tint that you want. Application is simple. I simply applied random dots of neat oil paint all over the model. Do as many or as few as you wish, and don't be shy or careful. Just do a Ted and slap it on. Now this looks like a nightmare, but don't panic. The reason you can only do this with oil paints is because they can take a very long time to dry. The next step takes advantage of this. For the next step, all you need is a couple of large, soft, flat brushes and some oil paint thinners. You can use Terps or White Spirit, but I recommend odorless artist oil thinners precisely because of the odorless part. To start with, I tried working the paint dry. No thinners, just a brush. Now this can sometimes work very well if the paint isn't too thickly applied, and it can give interesting results, so you should always try this first. I simply tried to work the paint away, trying to, but not always, go in a uniform direction. Where possible, I tried to stick to vertical strokes in the hope that I'd be left with rainwater-like streaking. However, it became apparent that unless I wanted the tank to look like it was coated in mushy peas, dirty, I'd kind of need to switch to a brush dampened with thinners. The goal is to end up with a very subtle discoloration, almost nothing at all, and so you really need to get most of the paint off, leaving only hints and streaks behind and colourful shades in the recesses. I left it to dry for 24 hours and you can see just how subtle the effect is. It just takes that factory fresh look away. Next, I needed to grime up some recesses and add some post shading to the panels to give depth and more variation. For this, I needed to do a gunk wash, and to that end I used Ammo by Mig Dark Streaking Grime. These are enamel weathering paints and, like oils, have a long cure time that allow them to be worked once applied. Now, as with the oils, this step cannot be done with any paints other than enamels or oils. Acrylics and lacquers cure too fast and cannot be removed once applied. The process is simple and has two steps. First, I applied the streaking grime to all the recesses and edges. I started off neat here, but by the time I'd finished I was slapping it everywhere. You can be as frugal or as messy as you like, because most of this will be coming back off again. The second step is equally as simple. After 10 to 15 minutes, I took a crap load of cotton buds, and I mean most of a pot, and simply rubbed the streaking grime away where I didn't want it. You can be all neat and just leave it in recesses, or you can work it blending and fading to leave shadows and darker patches around corners and panel edges and such. And you don't need to use thinners here at all, unless you've left it to cure for too long and it's being stubborn. Now, like the dot filter, if you want to be able to add shading and shadows, this must be done over a matte finish so that the paint can grip. If you do this over a glossy surface, you'll just wipe everything away except for the recesses. It is a slow process, so be patient. After that dried for 24 hours, it was time for a subtle rust wash. I mixed Skrag Brown and Lahmian Medium to make a nice, fresh rust colour. The Lahmian Medium is an acrylic matte medium. Basically, it's a paint with no pigment in it, and was used to dilute but not thin the paint. I wanted to make the paint more transparent, and that's what diluting does. Thinning with water or thinners would break the paint down and make it dry patchy and flow differently, which I didn't want, so diluting was the way forward. This way the paint will be more transparent and will be easier to get around edges and into recesses. It was applied in a targeted way, not all over. I'm not trying to tint the whole model, but rather simulate small areas of water buildup that lead to rust patches around rivets and edges and so on. Although the dozer blade isn't rusty, as I said earlier, there might still be rust staining leaching out from the nuts and bolt holes where water can collect. The same Skrag Brown wash was then liberally applied to the tracks in a more traditional wash to collect in recesses and create proper rusty track links. It was also washed over the exhausts at the rear. To complete the patchy corroded effect on the exhausts, I used Skrag Brown again, and also Towelite Ochre and Mournfang Brown. Rust varies in colour from dark, old rust to light, fresher rust, and so with a stiff brush these were stippled onto the stacks from dark to light. Then Fuegan orange shade was applied over the stacks to give that orange pop. Finally, a little Agrax Earthshade was wet blended into the Fuegan orange to create darker patches. Rust is easy and fun. Next up was Messy Times. Yes, I used Armour by Mig Dark Earth Pigment to create the earthy, dusty dirt underneath the tank and on the tracks. Real tanks are caked in mud and dirt all along the tracks as they chew the earth up. I didn't want mud, but rather dry earth. I simply applied Pigment Fixer to the area in question. And then piled on the powder. Now, some important things to remember. First, put paper down. Pigments get everywhere, and if you get them on your cutting mat / t-shirt / mum's kitchen table, they'll stain it forever, and your mum will give you a good old-fashioned Jack Meadows bollocking. Also, don't take powder straight from the pot as you'll contaminate them with Pigment Fixer. And lastly, keep in mind that even with Fixer, pigments are not permanently attached and can easily be rubbed off if not sealed in with a varnish, and even then they can still be removed without too much effort. When the pigments are all dried, knock any excess off the model or brush loose pigment off carefully. I don't recommend extensive pigment use if you wish to play the model on the tabletop. Pigments are really designed for display models. If you're making a tabletop play model, you'll be better off dry brushing acrylic earthy colours or using enamel mud and dirt paints for a more durable solution. Now, I had hoped to film painting the commander, but because he's glued into the turret, the big ass gun messed up the focus in half the footage, so unfortunately I can't put you through that. Apologies. However, after he had been painted, the next step was painting the searchlight with just 3 colours and 1 shade: the Fang, Fenrisian Grey, White Scar and Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm going for a stylised, turned off, shiny Fresnel lens effect. It's simpler than you think. First, I based the lens in the Fang. Then I added lighter patches top and bottom with Fenrisian Grey. The trick is to thin the paint much more than normal, so it's almost a glaze. One coat is transparent, but successive coats layered over the top increase the opacity, and if you make each coat smaller and smaller, you'll end up with a fade from transparent to opaque as you move towards the centre of the area. Now, I'm still learning this technique, to be fair, and I'm in no way experienced with it. If I got a sharp edge anywhere, I glazed the Fang back over it to build up the transition. And the final paint step was White Scar, again applied very thinly as a glaze where I wanted the lightest areas to be. Then with those done, I added a few highlight spots with regularly thinned White Scar. Then I fed the lovely dark blue Drakenhof Nightshade into the recesses of the lens and around the outer edge. Finally, after matte varnishing the rest of the model, I added a few coats of thinned ardcoat gloss varnish to create a glossy, glassy effect. With the model all matte varnished up, the final step was to add the shiny to any exposed metal parts that had been dulled down. Auric Armour Gold was carefully applied to the race parts of any gold details. And then Stormhost Silver was applied to the sharpest corners of gold trim. And any silver details, including shovel blades, details on the las guns, and of course as a dry brush over the tracks, grab handles and on edges here and there to suggest metal that has rubbed clean. And when that was done, there was only one thing left to do. Yes, the spinny thing. Oh, the spinny thing means, as ever, job done, build complete. I'm super happy with how this all came out, and I've thoroughly enjoyed bringing this pupper back from the dead. Now, I hope that throughout the project you don't feel I've been dismissive or snarky of the original artist. My aim, after all, is to show where they went wrong and to teach them how they could have done better. It would be super fun if the original owner saw this video. As I said way back at the start, I don't know the circumstances around the original paint job, and there could have been a reason it was painted as it was. It's not my job to mock, but encourage, and I hope I did just that. I'll be back soon with another patient. I have the next one all lined up ready to go, and when the world is not on fire and I can go outside again, I will of course be putting this build up for sale, so keep an eye on my website /Facebook /Twitters etc. for that in the future. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this project, and if you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the channel and helping to keep it alive by going to patreon.com/modelmakingguru and becoming a patron, or by clicking the join button under the video and becoming a channel member. Until next time though, take care, stay safe, be good, and wear a mask. Adios amoebas!